In this lesson, I'll show you how to come up with an initial idea based on jamming within a DAW. The overall constraint that I'm going to use is that I'm only going to use sounds that are freely available. I'll link to everything that I'm using in the lesson notes. And I'm also going to use just a few basic stock Ableton audio effects. These are pretty common, so most DAWs will probably have their own version of them. And my starting point constraint is that I'm just going to jam to try and find a chord progression. This is one of the most common ways to start a song. For song number one, if this is new to you, I would encourage you to just use the presets that come with instruments rather than spending a lot of time tweaking sounds, because we will go over a lot of that in part 2, and this is just about the bigger picture of arranging and composing a complete track. So I've got Ableton open here, and we're going to start by adding a new MIDI track and then adding an instrument that we want to play to that track. I'm going to start by using Spitfire Labs. It's a free and beautiful sample library. Just going to browse around these instruments until I find something that is inspiring. It's kind of nice. I'm literally just picking sounds at random. I'm also just kind of jamming with chords. I don't have any kind of plan. I haven't decided on a key. There's a lot of autopilot happening with my music theory knowledge, and depending on your level of experience, you may be thinking more about chords and note names and things like that or not. But the important thing is that however you can, you're finding some kind of chord progression, playing with different chords from a key. Okay, I like this. Okay, yeah. I'm feeling this sound the most out of everything that I've auditioned so far. This is a wobbly string. I favor C minor a lot. I'm just gonna go with that. All right, I have an 8 chord progression that I'm really feeling. I think that's what I'm gonna work with for my version of this song number 1. Now, something that might be helpful, instead of just jamming around, there is a more concrete way to come up with chord progressions, and we did go over it in the Theory Fundamentals lesson, but it's generating random sequences of numbers between 1 and 6, and then assigning those to chords within a key according to the scale degrees that we talked about. So if you're not coming up with something you're feeling just by jamming, or maybe you don't feel confident enough in your music theory skills, let's go over this approach. I'm gonna go to a random number generator. Google has one, minimum 1, maximum 6. Generate. Okay, 6, 4, 1, 2. 6, 4, 1, 2. Let's, for the sake of ease, go with C major. The 6 is A minor, the 4 is F, the 1 is C, and the 2 is D minor. Let's play that with our string sound. That already sounds pretty nice. Now, for my taste, I feel like I would like to hear something instead of that D minor, so, you know, I might modify that. Playing a G there instead, that could be nice. Or maybe just removing the D minor and holding on that C for longer. So this is a great way to kickstart the process, and also, as you can see, I'm bouncing back and forth between what I perceive as external and internal ideas. So, you know, generating a chord progression from random numbers, that kind of comes from outside and enters my brain and my heart. But then paying attention to how that makes me feel and what I like about it and what I don't like about it, that gives me ideas within that I then act upon, that I then bring to the table here. And the same kind of thing was happening when I was choosing sounds. It was a little bit of interplay between what the sounds kind of sparked in me and what kind of chords I felt like would be good with that sound. So when you've got a progression you like, figure out kind of how fast you want these chords to be changing. You know, as you're playing along, hopefully you're counting a bit in your head, you're feeling out what the tempo of your track might be. Going back to our example progression, I feel like I was kind of here with like a 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm gonna tap tempo that into Ableton. And that gives me, if I turn the metronome on, my tempo. It's a little bit slow maybe, I'm just gonna nudge it a bit. Yeah, let's just call that 105. So now recording along with the metronome, I can put down this chord progression. If you don't have tap tempo in your program, that's okay. Just count along as the metronome is playing and see if you can zero in on what that tempo is. So if you listen to that, that's obviously way too slow. You'd want to speed it up a bit as you're counting along. Maybe you've overshot it, bring it back down. So when you have your tempo set, keep your metronome on and record the chord progression onto your MIDI track. And now what you're gonna wanna do is cut down that recorded clip to the probably a multiple of 4 bars that your chord progression is. And then you have that as something you can loop. I find it's good to lay out a few repetitions of your chord progression because then that makes it easier to maybe tweak one of them and create a variation and then create more interest as your track goes on. So for instance, maybe I will use that first D minor chord that was suggested by the random number generator. I'll just add it in here. But I'll just have that the first time around, and then the second time the chord progression does hang on that C at the end. So that's a great little way to develop things. Just make the loop twice as long as the first thing you came up with and make 1 or 2 changes to one of them. I'm gonna go over one more way to get your chord progression into your DAW, and that's by drawing the MIDI notes on your piano roll. This might be something you wanna do if you're not quite comfortable enough playing keys and being able to make the changes fast enough. It could also just be a different approach for you to be able to experiment with your chord voicings. So I'm gonna make a MIDI clip that is as long as the chord progression I wanted to work with. I'm gonna go with my original C minor idea, and I'm just gonna draw the notes in. If you're not familiar with a piano roll, as you can see on the screen, it's like a sideways piano, and you can put in notes wherever you like. So I'm gonna go through and enter my chord progression, knowing which notes are part of which chords and being able to see all the notes laid out here on the piano roll, as well as horizontally being able to see all the different beats and bars. So I've got my full chord progression here as just sustained chords. But when I was jamming on that chord progression, I wanted some space in between those chords. So I'm actually gonna shrink these all down to maybe half a bar, maybe quarter notes even. Maybe half a bar. Yeah, I like that for now, for what I'm gonna work with. But let me show you one more thing. This probably will work better with a different sound. Let's say I wanted to do this track with a more piano-y sound. That type of instrument would probably lend itself to a more rhythmic way of playing rather than just holding chords. You know, if you're jamming with a piano. That's a really natural way to add some movement and excitement to a part. So when you've got your chord progression, whether you've drawn it out or played it in, maybe experiment as well with the rhythm that it's playing in. Here I've shortened my chords to eighth notes and selected all of them, allowing me to continually copy and paste them and move the copies to experiment with rhythms. Hey, just dropping in from the future real quick. We have a chord progression to work with now, but I wanted to cover one other way to help find inspiration, and that's by processing your sounds using audio effects. Sometimes just by changing the nature of a sound, it can open up entirely new ways for you to work with it. A whole bunch of different ideas for what you could do in your music. So I'm gonna break down 4 effects that are really common. It'll be great for you to learn these anyway, and we'll keep on using them throughout the course. And I'll just cover the standard parameters that you would find on any version of these plugins, no matter what company is making them, even though some of them, like even the ones you're about to see in Ableton, will have some random extra features. So let's start with reverb. Reverb adds space to a sound. It kind of emulates what it's like to be in a larger space, but it can also be taken to extremes and do kind of artificial sounding spaces as well. I'm gonna play a chord without reverb on it. And now through the reverb, as you can hear, it creates this huge sense of space, and the main thing you're hearing there is the decay time. So that indicates the time in milliseconds or seconds that it takes for the reverb to die down. And mainly what you're hearing in that reverb tail is what we call the diffusion of the reverb. If I turn the diffusion down, you don't hear much at all, but there's actually one small thing going on, and that is the early reflections. If I boost that and also increase this pre-delay time, you can hear that there's a little repeat of the sound that we put through it, and it's not all smeared out like the big reverb tail. It's actually just a little echo. And that emulates what a lot of real spaces are actually like. You'll often hear this more distinct reflection. It's more intelligible. It's closer to what the original sound sounds like. It's like an echo. And that type of sound is distinct from the more smeary, washed out reverb trail. Now the decay time also has an effect on the reflections. It kind of makes more echoes. And that also works in tandem with a parameter called size or room size, which is like an algorithm that emulates larger and smaller rooms. Now, in many reverbs, there are 2 ways to affect the tone of the reverb, and the first one is input processing, some kind of filter or EQ that's applied to a copy of the sound that's going through it, and that is the one that the reverb ends up being applied to. So for instance, here we've got this high cut happening, and so when our reverb responds to that, it's going to be darker. Of course, you have the opposite with the low cut. And the second tone shaping tool is after the reverb, and this is the same kind of thing, an EQ or a filter, but applied to the post-reverb sound. The reason why there are these 2 different tone controls is because the reverb algorithm responds to what comes into it. There's a little less control over that. You're basically dealing with tons and tons of different delays and reflections when you're looking at a reverb. So the post EQ gives you a bit more actual control over the final sound. The final standard parameter is the dry-wet, which is something that you'll see on a lot of effects, and it just refers to the mix between the original signal and the effect. So at 0, you don't hear the reverb. As you turn it up, the reverb gets louder. Until at 100, all you have is the reverb. Okay, the next effect we're looking at is delay, which serves a similar function to reverb. It's all about creating space, but it does it in a different way. It repeats the audio that you feed into it very distinctly. You're able to set the time interval that those echoes occur, and a lot of delays also will sync to your DAW's tempo. So you'll have not only a time control in milliseconds typically, but also a beats amount that you can set. So right now we've got it at 3, usually it's in eighth notes. So if we listen to this with a metronome, you'll hear that rhythm. As an example of another kind of rhythm, here's 1/8 note. Now, if we switch that from the synced beat setting to just time, like freely being able to choose milliseconds or seconds for your delay, you won't have that metronome locked in rhythmic delay, but it's still an effect that you might want sometimes. Depending on the track you're working on, sometimes you want a really synced delay, and sometimes you want something that just feels like it's free and floaty. Or even something that's really short, which kind of does what a reverb does in terms of creating the sense that you're in a bit of a space. Now you'll notice we have 2 of these time controls, and that's because a lot of delays will offer stereo effects. So you can have the left channel and the right channel delaying at different intervals. Another great way to add to the space. Some delays have a feature called ping pong, which is another way to have some stereo fun, and that alternates the delays between the left and right channels. Just like the reverb, a lot of delays will have some kind of filter or EQ that affects the delayed signal. Feedback is an important control. That feeds the outputted signal back through the delay, and that's what causes more echoes. So if we had feedback as 0, you just get 1 delay tap. But as you increase the feedback, each of those successive delay taps gets fed back into the delay, and so it creates this kind of succession of quieter and quieter echoes. Next, let's look at filtering. The 3 most common types of filters are low pass, high pass, and band pass, and what those do is completely remove certain parts of the frequency spectrum. With a low pass filter, wherever you set the frequency parameter, that's where frequencies higher than that start tailing off, eventually dropping to 0. The high pass is the reverse of this. It cuts everything below the frequency that you set. And a bandpass centers around the frequency you select and cuts both below and above it. The other big important control here is resonance, and that's basically a boost right at that frequency that you've chosen. It's just something that sounds good. Here's a low pass filter with 0 resonance. If we increase that resonance, it just emphasizes the movement of the filter, which is a really fun effect. The last thing I'll show you today is distortion. There's a lot of different flavors of distortion, but basically there's one important control, which is the gain, or sometimes it's called the drive. I'm gonna play a low note to demonstrate this. So Ableton offers a few different flavors of distortion here with their amp effect that emulates different guitar amps. Distortion takes your sound and really dirties it up. It adds a lot of extra harmonics in the high end. A lot of times it'll make things louder, so watch out for that. It's a great effect if you want things to really bite or be heavy, but you can also use it in smaller amounts to make a sound just a touch more aggressive without it being overwhelming. I want to go over one more general thing about effects, and that is send tracks. If you're able to add send tracks in your DAW, what they do is host effects that you can then send your audio to from your other actual instrument tracks. And usually on your send tracks, you would set the effects to full wet because the dry part of the signal is still coming through on the original track. So let's put a reverb there, full wet, and send our piano to that send. So as I increase how much volume is going to the send, of course, we hear more of the effect. Sends are really helpful for a number of reasons. One, you might have an effect that doesn't give you a dry wet option and you want to be able to blend in some of the original signal. Another great thing is that you can send multiple instruments to the same effect, and you can even send them in different amounts, which might be a creative choice that's right for certain tracks. For instance, with a reverb, maybe you want a lot of the instruments in a song to feel like they're in the same kind of space, so you would send all of those ones to the same reverb rather than having an identical reverb on each of those channels. So then you'd have that one reverb on the send processing all the instruments and kind of gluing them more together than if you had the individual reverbs on each track. Another great thing about sends is automation, and I'll continue with our reverb example, but sometimes I really like to send just 1 or 2 drum hits to the reverb while the rest of them are more dry. And if I had a reverb on the drum track and then just cranked it to wet for those moments, I would lose the original signal. So this way, the drums are still playing, you still hear them all, but every once in a while you get that hit that's extra impactful and epic. We'll go over lots more effects throughout the course as they become pertinent, but I did want you to have at least those big 4 in your arsenal because they do so much to change the quality of a sound, and they can sometimes affect the ideas that you come up with. A distortion is probably going to take you in a grittier direction. A delay or a reverb might affect the way that you play because you don't need to fill up as much space. So definitely fun stuff to experiment with as you're coming up with your initial idea. And that's what you should go do right now. Have fun.